This is an ABC podcast.
John Grisham is the author of many, many best-selling novels that largely take place within the American legal system. Before he took up writing, John Grisham was a trial lawyer and a member of the Mississippi State Legislature. And his books often expose the clubbiness of the legal system and the way that it can callously destroy the lives of innocent and powerless people. And he has a long-standing involvement with the Innocence Project in the United States, a movement dedicated to exonerating people who've been wrongfully convicted of major crimes. And they do this through DNA testing. I'm talking to John, who's in Virginia right now. Hello, John.
Hello. How you doing? Down under.
Very well, sir. Yes, a long way away too. In the judges list, your book, your killer judge has this pristine public image. He's got an A+ rating from the bar. Why make a psycho killer a judge? What were you looking at there, John?
Well, I had to choose someone who wants to be a psychopath. It's fiction, okay? And I never, in the history of the United States, we have a pretty clean judiciary. We've had very few criminal convictions of judges, but we've had some. But never has a sitting judge been accused of murder. Everything else, every other crime you can think of, especially kickbacks and bribes and extortion, things like that, you would expect for judges to get caught up in. But that's not unusual, but it has happened. But never murder. And to think that a sitting judge who is highly regarded could be accused of murder or even guilty of not just one murder, but several murders, I thought it was a pretty intriguing idea. I wanted to write a book that would hopefully frighten the readers, something I rarely do. So it was a departure. There's no great issue involved in this book. Most of my books have some type of exploration of a great injustice or an issue that is troubling the system. So I took the lighter route, just wrote about a judge who kills people.
I remember reading Alan Moore, who wrote the brilliant graphic novel From Hell, which was about the Jack the Ripper murders. And in writing about the murder of Marie Kelly, he said that to recreate that moment and the strange ritual around it took him right out in his mind to the further stages of existence, to one of, it's about as strange a place as you can ever go to. Did you feel that when you go and exploring, when you have to sort of tread into the kind of, the psychology of that kind of a killer?
No, I keep my distance. I keep a balance. What I research, what I read, and where I go. This guy was not driven by sexual deviations or sexual hang-ups. He was just driven by this weird sense of retribution, the need to get revenge. But no, I never get that too deep into my characters because I don't want to. I want to forget these people as soon as the book's finished.
Your stories often portray, like I said, the legal world in your part of the United States is a very clubby place. And I suppose that's because, you know people in a small town for a long while, you have that extension of trust. But is it as clubby as it seems, and can that be a problem?
The judicial system is pretty clubby because you're talking about a small percentage of the population. Even though we have 1 million lawyers, we have 330 million people. But the lawyers and judges all know each other, usually hang out with each other. A lot of them come out of the same law firms, same law schools, same offices of prosecutors. And yeah, it's pretty clubby. I'm not sure that's always bad. It just depends on the individual judge. What we have in this country, though, what I don't like, we have elected judges. And when you have elected judges, as we do in 35 states, then politics enters into every aspect of the judge's life, from election and re-election, from the decision how to rule in certain cases. Political fallout becomes a factor that it should not be there. And in many cases, these people run for these offices and they have to become politicians. They have to make promises. They have to raise money. They take money from future litigants who might come before their courts. It's a bad system, and we've had several cases in certain states where people running for re-election to the state Supreme Court knew some of the cases that were coming down the pipeline in the appellate process, and they took money from the corporations, the big corporations, the litigants who had cases pending, and then refused to recuse themselves once the case was before them, and that should be against the law. But I despise this part of our judicial system, and I wish we would change it, and we're not going to.
Yeah, many Australians are astonished to find out that judges are elected in many states in the United States. Like you say, what's the thinking behind even having them elected in the first place, John?
I'm not sure there is rational thinking behind it.
Right.
I'm not sure that it's grounded on anything that makes any sense. I think it's traditional. It goes back to a more gentler time when things were not as divided and partisan as they are now. Politics here gets rougher every 4 years. Every year, I guess, it just gets tougher and rougher and more partisan. And at the state level, it's very unusual for a sitting judge to be defeated. At the federal level, the judges are all appointed for life, which is another problem. They don't face re-election, which I like that, but no one should have a lifetime appointment. Or look at our Supreme Court; those are all federal judges. We call them Article III judges from Article III of our Constitution. For some reason, they can serve until they die, and that's not good. There needs to be some kind of term limit, to get these people off the course. And there's several thousand federal judges across the country right now at different levels, trial judges, appellate judges, Supreme Court judges at the federal level, that are all appointed for life. That's not all. That's a better system because generally you get better judges, but I don't like the lifetime appointment. But for the state judges, it's just a traditional approach to electing, democracy. We get to vote for everybody. That's where it came from years ago. And we started electing judges and prosecutors. We elect prosecutors, which, again, is not a good idea.
Years ago, John, I had an interview with Justin Brooks, who's from the Innocence Project in California. Tell me how you got involved with the Innocence Project in the United States.
It goes back to a book I wrote 15 years ago, a book called The Innocent Man, which is the only true story I've written. And the book was inspired by the story of a guy who was my age, my same background, religion, everything, who was sent to death row by his hometown. He was framed for a murder in a small town in Oklahoma. And he came within 5 days of being executed after being on death row for a number of years for a crime he had nothing to do with. He was mentally ill, and he got some help after his life was spared by a federal judge. A very brave federal judge intervened and saved his life, and he's still in prison. And he heard about DNA testing. It was brand new. It was 1995. And he saw a TV show about DNA testing, and he contacted a lawyer, and one thing led to the other. They finally arranged, it took 4 years, they finally arranged for him to be tested by DNA, and he was completely exonerated of the rape, murder of a young woman. And the DNA testing nailed the real killer, and the real killer was someone who knew the victim and was the last person seen alive with the victim the night she left a honky-tonk, a nightclub, a lounge. And the police were too stupid to put the case together and totally incompetent at every level. And they screwed up. They botched the whole case. But anyway, they put Ron Williamson, my guy, in prison. And I read about him. And so I took off to Oklahoma to write this book. I'd never written nonfiction before. And so I pursued the story for 18 months and wrote it and published it. And well, once the book came out, it got a lot of attention. And the Innocence Project in New York asked me if I would serve on the board. And I said yes. The research and writing of that story took me into the world of wrongful convictions, a place I had never really spent much time before. I never really thought about it. I practiced law for 10 years. I had a lot of clients who were criminals and are charged with crimes and who pled guilty or went to trial or whatever, went to prison. I had all different types of clients and cases. And I never had a client. I never had one single client I thought was wrongfully convicted. It just didn't happen where I practiced law because the cops were straight, the judges ruled over the courts, and the prosecutors played it straight. And, it was a good system. And as it is in most jurisdictions. But there are a lot of bad ones that I realize. And there are thousands of innocent people in prison in America.
Yeah, like how big is this, the scale of this, the extent when it comes to wrongful convictions?
Well, it's pretty staggering. It's impossible to know because no one has the time or the money to go back and study all the convictions because there are millions of them. We have 2.3 million people locked up right now. That's the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And that's a whole different set of issues, how we have so many nonviolent people locked up and why. And that's a book I'm going to write one day, Mass Incarceration. So we have 2.3. And there's some pretty decent studies that estimate between 2% and 10% are wrongfully convicted. Well, that's between 45,000 and 200,000. That's a lot of people. And we know through the work at the Innocence Project that there are just a lot of people in prison that we're trying to get out. Some will never get out. Some, they won't get out because a lot of crimes do not involve DNA testing. There's nothing left at the crime scene. There's no semen, blood, skin, whatever, hair that can be tested. And so those are very difficult cases to unravel and to prove innocence. But that's the kind of work we do. And we have a big office in New York. We litigate from coast to coast. We take cases from all 50 states. In 25 years, we've had 375 DNA exonerations. And that's clear biological proof that our man is innocent. I think there may be one woman involved in that number, but almost all men. And that's the tip of the iceberg. We have so much work to do, and we labor away, raising money to hire lawyers, investigators, to litigate and try to get our clients out of prison. It's frustrating work. It's in this country, it's not that difficult to send an innocent man to prison. That happens all the time. It's virtually impossible to get one out. Once he's there, it's very, very hard to get him out, especially if there's no DNA testing. And so those are the battles we fight every day. We fight. We have clients on death row right now. Of the 375 we have exonerated, several of those were on death row, sent there to die by juries and judges and prosecutors, and they were completely innocent. It's the kind of work that is frustrating, it's frightening, but it's also exhilarating when you are able to walk out a client after 20 or 30 years in prison for somebody else's time. It's really hard to turn that off at night when you're trying to go to bed.
The idea of an innocent person being executed by the state is particularly horrifying. The man you wrote your book about, Ronald Williamson, how close did he get to being executed wrongfully for this crime of murder and rape?
He came within 5 days, and
oh God,
by then he was out of his mind. He'd lost 100 pounds and was really crazy, not getting any mental health help on death row. A pretty conservative federal judge in Oklahoma. He did not have a lot of patience with lawsuits filed by our prisoners to get out. But his staff, one young lady in particular, kept reading Ron's case and reading. And she became convinced that Ron, she wasn't convinced Ron was innocent. She was convinced that Ron did not get a fair trial. And she took the case around the office, and she was not to be denied. She leaned on all of her colleagues, and she finally convinced all of them. The clock was ticking loudly because the date was set for the execution. And the clerks and lawyers in the office finally marched into the judge's chambers one day and shut the door and said, well, you've got to listen to us. We don't know if Ron Williamson is innocent, but we know he did not get a fair trial. We want you to stop this execution right now. It's 5 days away. They had a very long, spirited discussion, and the judge finally agreed. He said, I think you're right. I don't think justice was served here. And I interviewed the judge years later when I was writing the book. I went to his home in rural Oklahoma. We had lunch together and had a good visit. And I asked him, I said, well, at that time in Oklahoma, the way the courts worked, if you had said no to Ron, his lawyers would have appealed immediately to the appellate court above you. And that would have they would have stopped the election, the execution. And he said, oh, no, that would have taken too long. The appeals to the 10th Circuit in Denver would have taken too long. And in the meantime, Ron would have been executed. And so that's how close he came to being killed. And that's terrifying. And we have executed innocent people in America in the last 50 years.
I think the question a lot of people ask that's terribly confusing is, maybe this is a bit naive, this question, but why do people confess under questioning to murders that they haven't done, could not possibly have done, John?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It really is hard to deal with when you have a false confession case. Not everybody is as emotionally grounded as you, me, the next guy, as we think we are. And you don't know what you might do in the basement of the police department after 10 hours of nonstop interrogation from 2 or 3 different policemen who are veteran interrogators who know all the dirty tricks and are allowed by our laws to use dirty tricks into getting you to confess. And they break you down. It's a breakdown. They break your will, your spirit. And I've talked to some of these young men who've been through this, and it is a horrifying experience. And once the interrogation is, most of them finally confess just to get the damn interrogation over with. They want to go back to their cells and try to regroup. The next morning, the next day, they always recant. It's too late. Once you confess, you're going to be convicted because the question you just asked me, no, people just do not believe, jurors do not believe we would ever confess to something we didn't do. There are professional interrogators, military-style interrogators who do not use torture. They use fear, who can break you down in a matter of, a couple of hours. There's stories about these people. Most small town cops are not that sophisticated, but they do. Every police department of any size has the go-to guy to get a confession, and they'll bring him in after 4 or 5 hours of badgering and all that. And there's no more physical abuse. Supposedly, you can't abuse a prisoner anymore, but it still happens, and it's just a total breakdown. I'm dealing with a young man in Oklahoma who's been in prison for 36 years. He's the last of the ones I wrote about in The Innocent Man who's still in prison. The other 2 murders, 4 guys, the other 3 have gotten out. He's still in prison, again, after 36 years. And he confessed. And he told me that the confession he gave in no way matches anything remotely near the physical evidence once it was finally put together. He said after 14 hours of interrogation, nonstop, he was 20 years old and not very sophisticated. He said the cops kept suggesting, facts, suggesting methods, suggesting places where the body might be, that kind of stuff. And he got confused. He made some mistakes. And once you make a mistake, they beat you over the head with that. And he said, finally, I just said, okay, I'm going to tell them what they want to hear, because tomorrow when they go check the facts, they're going to realize I'm just lying. And that's not unusual. I had one young man, different case. One young man said, I would have confessed to killing my mother to get out of that room. And that's the intense abuse that they are put through and the intense pressure. And of the 375 exonerations by DNA we have with the Innocence Project in New York, 25% involve false confessions.
John, you had a childhood in the Old South, in rural Arkansas, in parts of Tennessee and other places as well. I remember hearing that the American poet, the Georgian poet, George Dawes Green, saying that this is where the whole thing of the moth came from. He said there was a culture in the rural South of storytelling on the porch. That's where he got the title from. The moth is the thing that's sort of zinging around the light bulb on the porch while people tell stories. Were you exposed to that culture of storytelling as a kid?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was very much a part of my childhood. We were in the cotton patch, as we say. We were cotton farmers. My father was, my grandfather was. The first 7 years of my life was on a cotton farm in Arkansas. And very much a part of our daily lives was in the summertime and fall, we were harvesting cotton, was to work the fields all day. And then after dinner, go to the porch and turn on the radio to get the St. Louis Cardinal baseball game out of St. Louis, which was a nightly ritual and one we never missed. And to tell stories and to listen to my grandfather and father, even my mother. Sometimes a cousin or an uncle would stop by, and there was no television back then. 1960, there was no television where we lived. Some people had them. That's how remote it was. The stories were just a matter of pride in being able to spin a yarn, to be able to tell a great story. After I'd published, I don't know, probably 15 books, I wanted to write a story that had nothing to do with the law, no lawyers. I wanted to write a childhood memoir, and it's called A Painted House. It came out in I guess it was about 20 years ago. And I wanted to take all these stories that I'd heard when I was a kid, and even my whole life, told by my father and grandfather, and at least accumulate them, gather them in one place, put them in one book while my parents were still alive so they could help me remember all the stories. And they all came out in A Painted House. So I was able to get them memorialized in the book, some time back. But yeah, it's just, I'm not much of a storyteller, but also I spent a lot of time in courtrooms when I was a very, very young lawyer. And a lot of trying a case or defending someone or prosecuting a plaintiff's case is the narrative. And because you're trying to convince a jury, you're trying to convince 12 people. It was very important to be able to communicate and to tell your version of the facts, to tell a story. So that was where the storytelling came in handy.
Was there a culture of listening as well? I say this because there was a similar culture of storytelling and listening in country Australia until the arrival of TV as well, where it was understood it was good to be a good storyteller, but you were also expected to be a good listener as well.
Well, especially for children. We live in a pretty strict Southern Baptist, disciplined culture where children you were to be seen and not heard. It was okay to talk a little bit, but not much. And that was ingrained in me and my siblings as children. You really thought about speaking in the presence of adults because that was considered rude. And I guess that goes hand in hand with listening. You sure were not encouraged to tell stories as a child. That never happened. Not that I probably couldn't tell a good story as a child. It took a while to learn how to do that. But yeah, I guess so. But I never, nobody listens anymore because of television. So it doesn't matter anymore.
You were in Mississippi for so many years. Very beautiful part of the world, mostly rural. Has the highest African American population per capita in the US, I think. Has been the scene of so many critical battles in the civil rights movement, which were probably going on in your childhood. How much of that conflicted history and culture do you imbibe growing up in a place like Mississippi?
It's very much a part of growing up because of this almost ridiculous glorification of the Civil War that is so ingrained in every Southern kid my age and even before. I don't think it's that way now. But this glorious lost cause that we all grew up believing, and we we worshipped the heroes of those battles, for many years, and grieved over the fact that we lost the war. And we didn't stop to see it as a war to further white supremacy, which that's all it was. It was a continuation of slavery. Now, because of the protests from so many African Americans, because of protests from so many white Americans who are saying we should, that was a wrong way to teach history. We have to look at history now and see how it really happened. You can't justify 6,000 lynchings of young Black men over a 100-year period in the Deep South. You can't justify that. You can't ignore that. It really happened. And so I hope we're taking a long, hard look at our history and getting away from this ridiculous love of the Civil War that I grew up with. It was ingrained in me as a child. I went to Civil War battlefields as a kid and hiked around, replaying the battlefields, and that was great fun. We grew up that way. That was a lot of fun without really stopping to think about what the war really meant.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app, or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
John, before you went to law school, tell me about the kind of odd jobs you took on to make a living before you were able to actually become a lawyer.
Well, we had to work. I mean, when I was a kid, when I was 5 years old, we were in the cotton fields. And we got paid a little bit for that, but that's, farm families, everybody had to work like that. Luckily, when I was 7 years old, we got off the farm. My father had finally lost all of his money and lost everything. So we fled in the middle of the night to get off the farm. And that was the single greatest event in my life at the time, at the age of 7, didn't realize it. But getting off the farm and getting away from that kind of a lifestyle, because we could not survive. The first job I got paid, I was cutting grass, mowing grass. I got paid for some of that. I got paid $1 an hour at a local nursery to water rose bushes. That was probably the most boring job I ever had. I would always get a summer construction job. My dad would always help me get a job. One summer, it was probably the worst job, was laying asphalt on a highway paving crew in Mississippi, where it's 100 degrees anyway. And you got the asphalt coming down. That was pretty brutal. Bulldozer operator. I finally got tired of construction. I paid for 2/3 of my college through summer jobs and saving money, and about half of law school, because we were just always expected. My parents, there were 5 kids. My parents expected all of us to go to college. They helped as much as they could. They did not get to go to college. They wanted us to. And we just had to work. We worked odd jobs wherever we could find them. Even in college, I worked odd jobs. I was always looking for another job. In college, it was to buy more beer and pizza and change. But that was very much a part of college. All kinds of jobs. I can't even think of all the jobs I did.
John, I understand the first time you were really praised as a fiction writer was by your law professor on a legal exam. How did that happen?
Well, I blew the exam. In law school, we have this really unusual way of grading law students. You're in a class for a semester, September through December, first year of law school. And you go to class 3 times a week, and the professor who's taught the material for years, I had really good professors, and they know the material very well. They call on you in class to discuss a certain case that you're studying from the case book, an old case. And it's very much a part of the law school routine for them to rough you up and embarrass you or trip you up, whatever, try to make a fool out of you because they're trying to make you tough. And so that goes on for 3 or 4 months until you have one exam. You have 1 4-hour exam per class. And that's your only grade for the class for the whole year. And so I was taking a class one time, and I was taking the final exam. Law school exams are also famous for being just totally these outrageous plots that would never happen anywhere in the world, but you in real life, you got to figure out how to unravel the legal issues, and this goes on and on. And so I got down to the very last problem, and I was worn out, exhausted. I had no idea what the problem was about. And so I just started writing about the characters. I took the characters in the legal problem, and I started writing a story about them. It had nothing to do with the legal problem because I didn't understand the legal problem. And I wrote 3 or 4 pages of that and finally turned the exam in, confident that once again that I had blown the exam and was going to flunk out of law school. And there goes my big dream. And when I got the exam a month later, I had a decent grade to my surprise. And the law professor said at the very bottom, on the last page, the last problem, he said, although you missed most of the legal issues involved with this problem, you have a real flair for fiction. So we kept in touch and have kept in touch 40-something years later. 10 years after that exam, my first novel came out in 1989. He called me and he said, do you remember your first semester exam? And I said, yes. He said, and what did I tell you? I said, yes, sir. He said, I'm very proud of you. So we've been buddies ever since.
So you got your law degree and became a trial lawyer representing people in very low incomes. How does defending regular poor people prepare you for life as a writer?
There are so many aspects of practicing law that can really prepare you for life as a writer, because lawyers see some really weird stuff. You see people who are in trouble. You see people who have really screwed up their lives. You see big lawsuits with big companies, corporations. You see a lot of good stuff. And most lawyers are pretty good storytellers. And there's no shortage of crazy cases, crazy clients. So many books I have written were inspired by something that happened back then. So a case I saw, a case I heard about, a case I was involved in, something another lawyer said. I still remember so much, and I've gleaned so many of those ideas to use in novels. So it's a great sort of a grooming place for stories. Most lawyers are not good novelists because they get caught up in the legalese, the fancy writing, and most lawyers who try to write want to impress you as the reader with how much they know about the law. And very few writers write clearly. I realized that fresh out of law school, I was really frustrated with the legalese, the verbosity of ideas and words that were unnecessary. And I said, I'm going to write clearly. John Steinbeck is one of my favorite literary figures, and I always loved John Steinbeck because he wrote so clearly, and I've always striven, if that's the right word, to write as clearly as possible, and I still do that. I'll write a sentence now, and if it doesn't sound right, I'll chunk it because I'm not going to try to fix it if it doesn't sound right. I'll try again, and I read that sentence out loud 2 or 3 times, almost every sentence, especially the dialogue, to make sure it's smart, it's clear, it makes sense. It's, so I'm always working hard to write clearly, unlike what most lawyers do.
You spent some time in the Mississippi legislature as a Democrat when such things were possible in Southern politics. This sort of reminds me of talking to George Saunders, who similarly had a series of different careers before he lit upon being a writer. And that made him, and has made him, very grateful for having discovered that profession and for being successful in it. Are you like that too, John?
Sure. I tell aspiring writers, especially young ones, students, no one finishes college and starts writing. No one turns 25 and starts writing or getting published. You've got to have a life. You've got to have a career. You've got to have something that you find emotionally and financially rewarding, satisfying. You got to pay the bills. You've also got to travel and do things, see and do different jobs and see other places and meet other people. And you got to live for a while. You got to taste defeat and the bitterness of setbacks and lost love and all, all the things that we humans go through and do to each other. You got to taste that before you can write about it. And very, very few. It's pretty rare that you see a novelist in this country published before the age of 30. It happens for the good ones, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think George was even older, quite a bit older than that when he first started getting published, because some of my favorite writers are people who've had, really strange, bizarre, colorful lives, and they've seen it all, and they love to write about it. I think it's very important to, get out of the office, get out of the classroom, get out, go live and work and travel and suffer. Nobody wants to suffer, but that's part of life, and you got to do that to be able to write about it.
On air, online, and on the ABC Listen app. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. You can subscribe to the Conversations podcast. To find out more, just head to abc.net.au/conversations.
I think you said your first book, A Time to Kill, which came out of a particularly gruesome case that you read about. It took you 3 years to write that, and you were married with 2 little kids at the time. How are you squeezing in time to write that as your first book?
The only way I could do it was to get up an hour earlier or an hour and a half earlier in the morning and go to the office. I would set my alarm clock for 5 o'clock, and I would roll out of bed. And there's so many days I didn't want to. My wife thought I was crazy. And I would shower quickly. My office was 5 minutes away. Drive to the office, make the coffee. And my rule on a normal day, 5 days a week, my rule was to sit down at my desk with the first cup of strong coffee, black coffee, and write the first word at 5:30. And that's what I did for 5 years. It took 3 years to write A Time to Kill. And by then I was very much in the habit of doing that every day. And A Time to Kill, I never broke stride. I went straight from there into The Firm. I thought The Firm was going to be something that was possibly more commercially accessible, more popular, and maybe it would sell. Over a 5-year period, I wrote those 2 books, with that kind of a routine. When The Firm came out 30 years ago, March of 91, kind of hard to believe. The Firm was just, an overnight big book. And that took the pressure off. I stopped waking up at 5 in the morning, put it that way. I started sleeping till 6. And so, but even today, old habits are hard to break. And today it's still 6 or 6:30 in the morning. I love to get up, and I still treasure the first few hours of each day in my little office where there's no phones, no fax, no internet, no music, nothing but, a dark room with a small window and a cup of coffee. And I get to create these stories that people still enjoy. And that's still gratifying to me.
There's no doubt that writing first thing in the morning, like really early in the morning, is absolutely the best time to write. And I wonder why that is. Do you think it's because the subconscious mind has been working away during the night and solving the problems that you ended up with at the end of the previous day?
I can only speak for myself. I don't carry the problems around with me. If I quit at noon, I try to quit between 11 and 12 when I'm in a real good spot. And Hemingway said he would stop halfway through a great sentence. So he would have the good sentence, he would just stop. because he knew what it was. He would think about it and come back the next day, and it was easy to pick it up. I'm not quite that way, but I like to stop at a good spot so I can leave with no problems. And so I won't be plagued with the idea, the uncertainties until the next day. And I really, once I stop and the morning's gone and it's time to move on with the rest of the day, I don't really think about exactly where I am. I'm always thinking about the story and the plot and what might come next. I do that driving down the highway or, whatever I'm doing. The next morning when I start again, I go back and read what I wrote the day before. It's usually about 1,000 words. And I go through that very slowly and edit, do a lot of editing then. But reading what you did the day before kind of gets you back into the rhythm of the story. And good suspense is a lot of good plotting. You got to keep the plot going and the subplots kind of circling in the air to make the story move. And that's all, that's all a question of timing and rhythm and, which subplot comes next. And so that's all, that just seems to work better at 7:00 in the morning than any other time of the day.
Like you say, the second book you wrote, The Firm, that was the one that was a massive, massive bestseller. I went back to The Firm before we had this conversation, and I went, yeah, it's an exciting story with, there's gangsters in it, there's murder and mayhem, and there's sudden riches coming to the main character. But it struck me going back to it that the real heart of the story is that it's really about a young man's whole life and how it becomes the plaything of both this corrupt law firm and the FBI. That's the emotional engine of the story, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, we spend a lot of time with Mitch backfilling into where he came from. And he was a poor kid from Kentucky and with a brain, really smart, and got into Harvard Law and started going down the road to which he barely recovered. But no, it's his family's tragic. His brother's in prison. Yeah, I wanted Mitch to be a very sympathetic character. But you have to have that almost always to write a good book, or certainly to write good suspense. You've got to have a very sympathetic character that your readers are going to care about, because when you get them in trouble, and that's always inevitable, you want the reader to really care about what's going to happen to Mitch. And but honestly, that was so long ago. I'm not sure I knew what I was doing when I started writing The Firm in 1987 or whenever it was, 88. It was so long. And again, I had written one book, but it has not been published then. And I don't know what I was doing back then. I got lucky.
I know you're a fan of John le Carre, and he's said a few times that when he created characters, he would sort of create the shell of someone that he needed for the story and then stuff bits of himself into it, as well as observations of other people. But that was the thing. And I'm quoting him here. He said, all fictional characters are amalgams. They all spring from much deeper wells than their apparent counterparts in life. All in the end are remoulded in the writer's imagination until they're probably closer to his own nature than to anyone else's. What do you think?
Well, very well said by one of my literary heroes who died December. He was 89. I was hoping I could finally meet him post-COVID. He had a huge impact on my career with a book he wrote, published in 1980, called Little Drummer Girl. And I read his earlier stuff. When I read Little Drummer Girl, it was one of those books that just, resonate with me, and it inspired me to try to write the best suspense, the smartest suspense I could possibly come up with, because that's what that book is, among many other things. Some characters you spend a lot of time with. Obviously, your narrator, your protagonist, your hero, your heroine, is always going to have the voice of the writer. I don't know how any writer could throw their voice into another person and let that person carry the ball for 500 pages. I have to watch that. I have really close friends who tell me they read my books and they can hear me talking the way I talk, the words I use. And I'm not sure that's always good. I don't want that to happen always. Some characters are, minor characters. You don't have time. When you write suspense, you're thinking about turning pages. You're thinking about the plotting, the pacing, the speed of the story. That's what I think of. That's what I want readers to do. I can't always spend a lot of time developing the characters. I'm not that good at it. It's not one of my strengths. Is spending a lot of time fleshing out people and also places and maybe relationships between people. I get bored real fast when I'm supposed to do that. So I don't always spend enough time with the characters. But the principal characters, your reader has got to know, your reader's got to get inside their head and know how they're thinking. And that's where the challenge is. How can you make your protagonist so real that the reader can almost predict what he or she's going to do next?
John, you were once a supporter of the death penalty when you were younger. What changed your mind?
I was on death row in Mississippi in 1994, researching a book called The Chamber. And I'd been there several times. At that time, I lived in Mississippi, and the state penitentiary was 2 hours from my house. So I'd made the drive many times to research the book. I had talked to guards, the prison officials, the prison lawyers, some of the inmates. I talked to the executioner. Back then, it was death by gas chamber, not lethal injection. It was the old-fashioned gas chamber, which was a big round tube with windows. They would strap you inside and release the gas, and that's what they were using back then. And I knew more about the gas chamber than I should have known. And back then in Mississippi, it's different now, but right before the condemned man is taken into the death room, that's what it was called, with the gas chamber in the center of it, he would spend the last hour in a holding room, which is a small cell next to the death room. And he would sit there for an hour with the chaplain, if he so chose, or his lawyer, if he so chose, or nobody. I was sitting in the holding room and on a little bunk bed, and I was sitting with the chaplain. The chaplain was a retired Baptist minister, an old guy who'd been serving the men on death row for a long time, volunteered, who wasn't paid for it. And we were talking about issues of retribution and issues of faith and closure, and pretty heavy conversation given where we were. The room was dark and death row was quiet. And he said, "John, you're a Christian, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I'm a Christian." He said, "Do you think that Jesus would approve of what we do here?" And I sort of hesitated. And I said, "No, he would not. He preached forgiveness, not retribution." And he said, "You're exactly right. That's why this is wrong. What we do here is wrong." At that moment, I did a 180 and realized that I'd been wrong my entire life about the death penalty. We can all agree that it's wrong to kill. So why do we allow the state to kill in our names? You can't justify it.
Just finally, John, I'm going to end with one of those great big, ugly, cosmic questions that interviewers like to end such interviews on. I'm asking this because you are a man of faith. Martin Luther King once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I really hope that's true. Do you think it's true, or is it just a nice thing to say?
I believe it's true because I want to believe it's true. I want to believe that in the end, right will always prevail over wrong, good over evil, justice over injustice. I'm not sure I see my country or much of the world bending toward justice these days. Right now, I think we're in a real moral quandary in this country about where we are and where we're going, who we are, where we're going. We're so divided, and feelings are so raw and political and ugly, and there's not much room for important, decent conversations. We see it at every level. It's a disturbing time here, and the future is could be even more disturbing if the wrong people regain power and have an agenda. It's very troublesome. The wrong people were in power, and they cared nothing about injustice. They cared nothing about the suffering of those people who are weaker and poorer than we are. So I want to believe that. I want to believe we're headed in the right direction, because to admit otherwise is to admit failure and to live in a world that's very frightening.
John, I appreciate your time. It's been lovely speaking with you. Thank you so much.
A lot of fun. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
John Grisham is the author of The Judge's List. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.